Welcome to the Lord of the Dark. In the grim darkness of the far future, a Tyranid splinter fleet descends upon the agri-world of Satis, deploying waves of rippers and termagants to strip the planet of all biomass. As the creatures consume everything from vegetation to soil microbes, Norn queens deep within the hive ships process the harvested genetic material, breaking down and cataloging millions of years of evolutionary data.
They do not hate us. They do not wish to conquer us. They only wish to feed.
Within weeks, the once fertile world is rendered a lifeless husk, its entire biological legacy absorbed and repurposed to fuel the ever-hungry hive mind. There is something uniquely terrifying about the Tyranids, and nowhere is that terror more perfectly illustrated than in what happened to the agri-world of Satis. Satis was, by all imperial accounts, an unremarkable world. It sat quietly in its system, producing grain yields and livestock harvests that fed dozens of nearby imperial worlds, the kind of planet that never made headlines in the annals of the Imperium because it was simply doing exactly what it was supposed to do. Billions of lives depended on its output in that indirect, invisible way that agri-worlds sustain civilization without ever receiving credit for it. The population was modest, the defenses were modest, and the ambitions of the people who lived there were modest too. They farmed, they shipped, they lived. Satis was the kind of world the Imperium takes completely for granted until the moment it is gone. The first sign that something was wrong came not from any planetary sensor array or astropathic relay, but from the behavior of animals. Farmers across the northern continent reported their livestock becoming agitated without cause, clustering together and refusing to eat, exhibiting the kind of instinctive dread that creatures feel when a predator is near but not yet visible. This detail, dismissed initially by local administrators as a disease scare or environmental anomaly, would later be recognized by Tyranid scholars as one of the earliest documented examples of shadow sense disruption on Satis. The hive mind was close enough that even non-psychic creatures were registering its approach on some biological frequency that human science still struggles to fully explain. The splinter fleet itself was not enormous by Tyranid standards. That is perhaps the most chilling part of this story for anyone who studies the Tyranid threat seriously. This was not Hive Fleet Leviathan bearing down on a fortress world. This was a fragment, a detached tendril of a larger organism, the kind of force the hive mind casually deploys to assess, strip, and move on from worlds that do not warrant a full invasion. Satis was not considered a challenge by the hive mind, it was considered a meal. The fleet emerged from the void in a formation that Tyranid analysts describe as a feeding posture rather than a combat posture. The distinction matters enormously to those who study these creatures. When Tyranids approach a heavily defended world, their fleet movements reflect tactical calculation, with bioships holding distance, screening vessels moving to intercept threats, and the approach sequence to minimize losses. When the fleet arrived at Satis, there was none of that caution. The hive ships simply moved toward the planet with the patient, unhurried momentum of something that has already decided the outcome. Several Tyranid cruiser equivalents formed a loose cordon around the planet, not to prevent Imperial reinforcement, though they would certainly intercept any, but to ensure that nothing biological escaped the surface once the harvest began. The bioships themselves are worth describing here, because their arrival at Satis tells you everything about how the hive mind perceives a world like this. These were not the massive world ship-class organisms that anchor major Tyranid invasions. They were mid-tier harvest vessels, organisms evolved specifically for stripping lightly defended or undefended worlds efficiently. Their hull analogs were thick with digestion pools and biomass processing organs, their internal architecture optimized not for war, but for consumption. They hung in low orbit over Satis like enormous, living silos waiting to be filled, And in a very real biological sense, that is exactly what they were. The Planetary Defense Force of Satis received warning approximately 4 hours before the fleet achieved stable orbit. 4 hours is an agonizingly short window in which to organize any meaningful resistance, and the commanders on the ground knew it. Astropathic distress calls were sent immediately, though every scholar who has studied this event notes with grim irony that the shadow in the warp had already begun to descend by this point. That psychic static generated by the hive mind's proximity that disrupts warp-based communication and navigation. Whether any of those distress calls reached their intended recipients in time to matter is something historians still debate, because no Imperial relief force arrived during the events that followed. What the PDF commanders chose to do with their 4 hours reflects a kind of tragic pragmatism that is deeply human. They did not attempt an evacuation, because there was no realistic way to move the surface population in time. They did not attempt to destroy the planet's food stores, which in hindsight might have at least reduced the biomass available for harvesting. Instead, they fortified. They pulled their forces into defensive clusters around population centers and communication hubs. They armed civilian militia groups, and they sent officers through farming communities urging people to arm themselves and head for the fortified positions. Some people did. Many did not, unable to believe that the threat was as severe as described, because nothing in the quiet history of Satis had ever prepared its people for this moment. By the time the first bioships achieved optimal harvest orbit and the initial deployment organisms began descending toward the atmosphere, the planet below was already fracturing between those who understood what was coming and those who simply could not process it. The hive mind, of course, made no distinction between the two. From its perspective, looking down at Satis with whatever passes for perception in an entity of its nature, there was only biomass to be collected, genetic data to be catalogued, and the vast, patient work of consumption to be completed. The arrival of the Splinter Fleet was not the beginning of a battle. It was the beginning of a harvest. The first thing the survivors would later describe, in the fragmented visions pulled from the minds of those few who escaped Satis before all contact was lost, was not the sight of the Rippers but the sound. A low, wet rustling that seemed to come from everywhere at once, like rainfall made of something alive. That sound was the Ripper swarms hitting the ground, and by the time anyone could process what they were hearing, the creatures were already spreading across the fields in their millions. Rippers are, in isolation, almost pathetically small. A single Ripper is a worm-like organism barely longer than a human forearm, equipped with a disproportionately large mouth filled with rows of tiny but devastatingly efficient teeth. They have no eyes in any meaningful sense, no discernible intelligence as an individual creature, and no apparent agenda beyond the simple, relentless imperative to consume. Looking at one Ripper in a containment jar, as Inquisitors and Magos Biologies have done on various occasions throughout Imperial history, you might almost find it underwhelming. The danger of the Ripper is not the individual. The danger is the swarm, and the swarm on Satis was unlike almost anything recorded in Imperial archives outside of the great Hive Fleet engagements. The Ripper swarms descended from the Splinter Fleet's bioships in what Tyranid scholars call a consumption cascade, a deliberate sequencing of creature deployment that the hive mind uses to maximize biomass extraction efficiency. The Rippers did not fall randomly across Satis. They were deposited in dense clusters at the edges of cultivated land, along the borders of forests and river systems, at the perimeters of settlements, forming a living tide that would then move inward from every direction simultaneously. This is not instinct in any conventional sense. This is strategy, alien and cold and utterly indifferent to anything except the math of calories consumed and genetic material catalogued. The hive mind had already mapped Satis from orbit, its shadow-casting bioships feeding sensory data upward through the synaptic web, And the Ripper deployment was the result of that analysis rendered in flesh. What makes this phase of the consumption so particularly horrifying to contemplate is the sheer biological efficiency of it. Rippers do not simply eat, they digest with extraordinary speed, their gut flora adapted over countless worlds of harvesting to break down virtually any organic compound into a transmissible bioslurry. They move through organic matter the way water moves through sand, consuming and processing simultaneously, leaving behind nothing but stripped earth and the faint chemical signature of their passage. Farm workers on Satis who had been in the outer fields reported seeing the creatures arrive at crop rows and simply flow through them, the standing grain vanishing into the swarm as though it had never existed. The speed of it was, by every account, deeply wrong in a way that defied easy articulation. Things should not disappear that quickly. The world should not come apart that fast. The Planetary Defense Force stationed on Satis attempted to respond, of course. The initial response was almost textbook, which is to say it was hopelessly inadequate for what was actually happening. Soldiers were dispatched to the field perimeters with flamers and heavy stubbers, and in the very first engagements they found that conventional suppressive fire against Ripper swarms is an exercise in futility. You can kill individual Rippers by the hundreds, and the swarm does not slow, does not hesitate, does not deviate from its path. The creatures have no pain response in any meaningful way, no self-preservation instinct that can be exploited, no leadership structure that can be decapitated. Flamers were more effective, the fire consuming swaths of the creatures in moments, but the PDF simply did not have enough flamers to cover the sheer perimeter they were dealing with, and the Rippers were not coming from one direction. They were coming from every direction, and the math simply did not work in the defenders' favor. There is a fan theory that circulates persistently in Tyranid lore communities, and it concerns the specific sequencing of Ripper deployment relative to other organism types. The theory holds that the hive mind deliberately sends Rippers first not merely for practical biomass consumption reasons, but because their arrival serves a psychological function, breaking the morale of defending populations before the more formidable organisms arrive. The argument is that watching the landscape itself being consumed, watching familiar terrain stripped to bare earth by something small enough to flow through fence gaps and drainage ditches, produces a particular kind of despair in human defenders that larger, more obviously threatening creatures would not. There is something to this reading. The soldiers on Satis were not simply facing a military threat. They were watching their world be eaten alive incrementally from the outside in, and the psychological weight of that was a weapon in its own right. By the end of the first planetary rotation after deployment, the Ripper swarms had consumed the outer agricultural rings of 3 of Satis' largest continental farming zones. The fields that had fed dozens of worlds were gone, replaced by bare, slightly darkened earth that smelled faintly of something chemical and alien. The creatures were already moving toward the inner zones, toward the settlements, toward the forests and river systems, following the synaptic direction of the hive mind, with the absolute, unthinking obedience of cells in a body. Somewhere above the clouds, the hive ships waited, and the first trickle of processed biomass was already beginning to flow upward through the biological conduits that connected the swarm below to the fleet above. The Rippers were never meant to fight. That is the brutal elegance of Tyranid deployment strategy, and it is something that the defenders of Satis learned far too late. The Rippers were the opening act, the biological tide that broke across the landscape to disorient, to consume the smallest and most dispersed biomass, and to signal to the rest of the swarm that the feeding had begun. What came next was something altogether different. What came next had teeth and guns and numbers that no planetary defense force was ever designed to withstand. The termagants arrived in waves that the survivors could only describe as walls, not lines of creatures advancing across a battlefield in any way a trained soldier might recognize, but literal walls of chitin and muscle cascading over hillsides and through valley corridors, filling every available space with bodies the way water fills a container. Each individual termagant stands roughly the height of a human child, which is one of those facts that sounds almost comforting until you see 10,000 of them moving together as a single coordinated entity. Their biomorphic weaponry already primed, their black eyes reflecting nothing, their movement guided not by individual thought, but by the psychic pulse of something vast and ancient and utterly without mercy. Satis had a planetary defense force because every imperial world of any value maintains one. The PDF of Satis was not a large or particularly well-equipped organization because Satis was an agri-world, and agri-worlds are not expected to hold off full-scale alien invasions. They were equipped to handle local unrest, to deal with the occasional raider, to put down civil disturbance. They had stubbers and lasguns and a handful of artillery pieces that had probably seen more ceremonial parades than actual combat. When the termagant waves crested the outer perimeter of the planet's primary settlement cluster, the PDF units stationed there opened fire with everything they had, and it was not enough. It was never going to be enough. The termagants carry a variety of biologically grown weapons, the most common of which is the flesh borer, a living gun that fires a burrowing beetle-like organism at high velocity. These beetles can penetrate light armor and then continue moving once they have made contact with a target, which makes being shot by a termagant an experience that no amount of battlefield medicine can adequately prepare a soldier for. The PDF troopers who held the first defensive line at the agricultural processing hub on the planet's northern continent fired until their weapons ran dry, cut down dozens and then hundreds of the creatures, and then were simply overwhelmed by the mass of bodies that continued pouring forward over the fallen. There is a grim mathematics to Tyranid warfare that the hive mind understands perfectly and that human commanders are psychologically ill-equipped to accept, which is that losses simply do not matter when the attacker has more bodies than the defender has ammunition. What made the termagant assault on Satis particularly devastating was not just the numbers but the coordination. Fan discussions in the wider Warhammer community have long debated the exact nature of termagant intelligence, and the consensus leans toward viewing them as something between a weapon and an organism. Creatures that possess just enough biological programming to react to immediate threats, but whose tactical behavior is entirely directed from above by the hive mind's synaptic web. On Satis, this manifested in ways that broke the PDF's defensive doctrine completely. When the defenders concentrated fire on a particular approach corridor, the termagant waves redirected fluidly, flowing around the killing ground and attacking from angles that had been left thinly defended. When a PDF unit managed to establish a strong point in one of the larger grain processing buildings, the termagants did not batter themselves against the fortified walls. They moved past it, cutting it off, surrounding it, and leaving it to wither while the swarm continued its advance. It was not intelligent in any way a human commander would recognize. It was something more unsettling than intelligence. It was perfectly optimized instinct. The secondary defense line collapsed within hours of the first. By the time the garrison commander at the primary settlement was attempting to organize a fighting withdrawal toward the starport, the termagants had already flanked around both sides of the settlement perimeter and were advancing from directions that the defense plan had classified as secured. There is a recurring theme in accounts of worlds that have faced Tyranid assault, and that theme is the discovery that whatever defensive plan existed was built around assumptions about how an enemy behaves, and the Tyranids simply do not share any of those assumptions. They do not value ground. They do not secure supply lines. They do not have morale that can be broken. They advance, they consume, and when a direction of advance becomes inefficient, they redirect without hesitation or ego. The termagant waves on Satis were not just a military action. They were also, in a very literal biological sense, part of the feeding process. As the creatures moved through the settlements and across the agricultural zones, they were consuming bodies of the fallen, both human and the Rippers, that had been crushed underfoot or killed by defensive fire, were absorbed into the advancing swarm's biological economy. The termagants themselves would eventually be broken down and recycled if they fell, their biomass too valuable to waste. Nothing on Satis was being destroyed in the Tyranid assault. Everything was being harvested, the violence and the feeding happening simultaneously, inseparably, as two expressions of the same fundamental drive. The fields of Satis had been its identity. Anyone who had ever visited the world described it the same way, a rolling green and gold endlessness that stretched to every horizon, broken only by the distant silhouettes of grain silos and the occasional hab cluster where agricultural workers lived out their quiet, unglamorous lives. Generations of farming families had worked that soil, had watched those fields cycle through seasons, had measured their years by the height of the grain and the color of the harvest. What the Tyranids did to those fields was not simply destruction. It was something far more methodical, far more complete, and in its own horrifying way, far more impressive than simple annihilation. The consumption of Satis's vegetation did not begin with the termagants, though they certainly accelerated it. It had already started, quietly and almost imperceptibly, with the rippers that had spread across the landscape in that first terrible wave. What many observers of Tyranid behavior fail to appreciate is that rippers are not merely mobile mouths. They are extraordinarily efficient biological processors, capable of breaking down organic material at a cellular level with digestive enzymes that would make a xenobiologist weep with reluctant admiration. As the rippers moved through the grain fields, they were not simply eating the stalks and leaves in any crude mechanical sense. They were dissolving them, converting plant matter into a semi-liquid biological slurry that could be absorbed, transported, and eventually funneled back toward the hive ships. Every blade of grass, every root structure, every seed head that had been weeks away from harvest, all of it began disappearing into the swarm with a speed that defied easy comprehension. There is a piece of testimony preserved in an inquisitorial debrief from one of the few shuttle pilots who managed to get airborne in the early hours of the invasion, and his account of looking down at the fields from above is one of those details that genuinely haunts you once you encounter it. He described watching the green and gold of the fields simply retreating, pulling back from the edges of the ripper swarms like water draining from a table. Except it was not retreating. It was being consumed so rapidly that from altitude, the effect was visually identical to watching something dissolve. He said the fields looked like they were being erased. That is the word he used, erased, and it is probably the most accurate word anyone has ever chosen for what the Tyranids do to a world's plant life. What makes this phase of a Tyranid consumption particularly fascinating, if you can stomach the fascination, is the sheer biological intelligence behind it. The hive mind does not simply send its creatures to eat indiscriminately. The swarm operates with an efficiency that suggests genuine priority assessment, something that has been a source of endless debate among xenobiologists and ordo-xeno scholars for centuries. On Satis, the early evidence suggests that the rippers and the initial termagant advance were directed first toward the most calorie-dense plant matter, the grain fields themselves, before moving outward toward the grasslands, the managed forests at the planet's temperate margins, and eventually the wild scrubland that covered the equatorial regions. This is not random. This is optimization. And the fact that a creature as seemingly simple as a ripper is participating in that optimization, even unconsciously, is a reminder that the hive mind is operating on a scale of intelligence that individual creatures only dimly reflect. The managed orchards that dotted the agricultural districts of Satis present a particularly grim case study. These were not vast fields, but carefully cultivated plots of fruit trees, some of them representing decades of agricultural investment, bred for specific yield characteristics and maintained by workers who took genuine pride in their produce. Survivor accounts from the settlement of Veth's Crossing, one of the last Hab clusters to fall, describe watching the orchards adjacent to their settlement disappear over the course of a single afternoon. Not burned, not torn apart, but consumed, the trees stripped of leaves first, then bark, then wood, then root systems pulled from the ground by clusters of rippers working in coordinated groups, the biological material flowing away from the stripped skeleton of each tree before even that skeleton was broken down and absorbed. By the time the swarm moved on from Veth's Crossing's orchards, the ground where the trees had stood was not merely bare. It was clean, almost unnaturally so, scraped of every organic trace down to the topsoil layer. Fan theorists within the wider Warhammer community have spent considerable time discussing exactly what the Tyranids gain from processing plant matter specifically, given that vegetation represents a less information-rich source of genetic material than animal life. The general consensus, supported by in-universe xenobiological texts like the studies attributed to Magos Biologius Viacae, is that plant matter serves two distinct purposes in the consumption hierarchy. The first is pure energy, the caloric fuel that sustains the swarm during the harvest operation itself, feeding the rippers and termagants that are doing the physical work of stripping the world. The second is genetic data, because even the relatively simple genome of a grain plant represents millions of years of evolutionary refinement for a specific environment. Adaptations to soil chemistry, climate patterns, pest resistance, drought tolerance, all of it encoded in biology that the hive mind can theoretically access and repurpose. A world's plant life is not just food. It is a library, and the Tyranids are checking out every book simultaneously. By the end of the first week on Satis, Imperial observers who had managed to maintain orbital sensor contact estimated that somewhere between 40 and 60% of the planet's total vegetation coverage had already been consumed. The fields that had fed dozens of worlds were gone. The managed forests were skeletal or already stripped. The wild scrublands were retreating faster than any natural fire could have spread. Satis was losing its green, losing the color that had defined it from orbit, and in its place was spreading something pale and bare and terrifyingly clean, the exposed mineral surface of a world being peeled down to its bones. The destruction of the surface was, in a grim and terrible way, only the beginning. Most people, if they imagined planetary consumption by the Tyranids at all, would picture what was visible: the fields stripped bare, the forests reduced to pulp, the livestock dissolved into rivers of organic matter flowing back toward the hive ships. That visible devastation was real, and it was total, but it represented only a fraction of what the hive mind actually wanted from Satis. Beneath the scorched and ravaged topsoil, beneath the root systems already being dissolved by ripper enzymes, there existed an entire hidden world of biological complexity that the swarm had no intention of leaving behind. Soil ecology is something that most people, including most Imperial citizens, never think about at all. A single handful of healthy agricultural soil from the fields of Satis would have contained billions of individual microorganisms, bacteria, archaea, fungi, protozoa, nematodes, and organisms so small and so numerous that their collective mass across the entire planet would have rivaled the biomass of everything living on the surface. These were not simple or primitive things, despite their microscopic scale. Many of the bacterial species in Satis's soil had been evolving in that specific environment for millions of years, developing metabolic pathways, chemical signaling systems, and survival strategies that were entirely unique to that world. The nitrogen-fixing bacteria alone, the organisms that made Satis's legendary agricultural yields possible in the first place, represented an irreplaceable library of biochemical solutions to specific environmental problems. The hive mind understood this with a clarity that no imperial agronomist ever could. The process by which the Tyranids harvested underground biomass was not the same frenzied, swarming consumption that characterized the surface assault. It was slower, more methodical, and in many ways more disturbing precisely because of its patience. Specialized organisms, some of which have been tentatively catalogued by Magos Biologis, researchers working from incomplete data, appeared to secrete complex chemical compounds into the soil that essentially broke down the bonds between soil particles and organic matter, liquefying the biological content while leaving the mineral substrate largely intact. Witnesses to the aftermath of Tyranid consumption on other worlds have described the soil left behind as having a strange, almost powdery quality, as though all the life had been neatly extracted from it, which is exactly what had happened. The hive mind does not waste a single molecule of recoverable biological material. What makes this phase of the consumption particularly fascinating, in the horrified way that Tyranid biology always ends up being fascinating, is that the Rippers played a role here too, just not in the way they had on the surface. Certain Ripper variants, smaller and more vermicular than the standard form, are capable of burrowing deep into soil layers, following root channels and moisture gradients down to considerable depths. These burrowing rippers were not consuming the microbes themselves in any direct sense. They were acting more like a delivery mechanism, their bodies producing and releasing the enzymatic compounds that broke down the soil matrix and then absorbing the resulting organic slurry back through their skin. Every ripper that burrowed down into the fields of Satis was essentially a living pump, drawing biological material upward through its body and eventually depositing it as concentrated organic waste that other organisms in the chain could process further. The mycorrhizal networks beneath Satis's fields deserve special attention here because they represent something that the hive mind would have found genuinely valuable. Mycorrhizal fungi form symbiotic relationships with plant root systems, creating vast underground networks that allow plants to share nutrients and even chemical signals across enormous distances. The agricultural fields of Satis had been cultivated over so many generations that these networks had developed extraordinary complexity, effectively connecting the root systems of crops across entire regions into a single communicating biological web. Some xenobiologists have speculated that the hive mind may have found this kind of distributed biological network particularly interesting from a genetic standpoint, not because it was analogous to the hive mind itself, though the parallel is uncomfortable, but because the fungal organisms responsible for it had developed highly efficient methods of long-range chemical communication that represented millions of years of evolutionary refinement. The deeper you go into the soil of any living world, the stranger and more specialized the biology becomes, and Satis was no exception. Below the rich agricultural topsoil, beyond the reach of even deep-rooted crops, there existed communities of extremophilic bacteria that had adapted to survive in conditions of very low oxygen, high pressure, and minimal nutrient availability. These organisms represented evolutionary lineages that had been isolated from the surface biosphere for geological timescales, developing in parallel with the surface life, but along entirely different adaptive pathways. The hive mind's harvesting apparatus reached them anyway. Nothing was too deep, nothing was too small, nothing was too obscure to escape the thoroughness of the swarm's biological audit. There is something philosophically devastating about this aspect of Tyranid consumption that tends to get lost in the more visceral accounts of surface destruction. When the fields burned and the forests fell and the livestock were dissolved, those losses were comprehensible. They were the kind of losses that war always brings, terrible but legible. The stripping of the soil microbiome was something different. It was the erasure of an invisible world that most of Satis's inhabitants had never known existed, a world that had been building its complexity quietly beneath their feet for as long as there had been life on that planet. Every one of those billions of microscopic organisms carried in its genome a record of adaptation, of survival, of evolutionary problem-solving that was specific to Satis and existed nowhere else in the galaxy. When the hive mind took them, it took something that could never be reconstructed, a biological history that the planet had been writing in the dark for millions of years. Once the underground harvest was underway, the sheer logistical scale of what the Tyranids were accomplishing on Satis becomes almost incomprehensible to contemplate. You have to step back and think about what was actually happening here, not just on the surface or in the soil, but as a coordinated biological operation running across an entire planetary body simultaneously. The hive mind was not simply eating Satis. It was dismantling it with surgical precision, and every gram of organic matter that was broken down had to travel somewhere. That somewhere was the hive ships hanging in orbit above, patient and vast and endlessly hungry, and the mechanisms by which the biomass made that journey are among the most disturbing biological engineering achievements in the known galaxy. The process began at the ground level with the Rippers and the Termagants, and the specialized bioconstructs that had moved in behind them. But the actual funneling of biomass upward toward the fleet required infrastructure, and the Tyranids had that infrastructure ready almost from the moment the first creatures landed. Capillary towers, which some Adeptus Mechanicus xenobiologists have described as the most elegant and horrifying structures in the galaxy, began erupting from the ground across Satis within the first days of the invasion. These are not towers in any architectural sense that a human mind naturally reaches for. They are grown rather than built, pushed up from the earth by specialized organisms that anchor themselves deep in the substrate and then extend upward at speeds that witnesses have described as visibly measurable, like watching a plant grow in a speeded-up pict recording, except that the plant is made of pale chitin and pulsing biological tubing, and it stinks of something ancient and wrong. By the time the Termagant waves were completing their sweep of the surface defenses, capillary towers were already rising across the farmlands of Satis, dozens becoming hundreds, becoming thousands as the days passed. What these towers do, in functional terms, is create a direct biological pipeline between the surface and the hive ships in orbit. The dissolved and broken down biomass, the fluid slurry that the Rippers and the digestion pools had been producing, was drawn upward through these structures by mechanisms that still are not fully understood by imperial science. There is a combination of biological pumping action, created by rhythmic contractions in the tower walls, similar to peristalsis in a digestive tract, and something that some researchers believe involves directed gravitational manipulation at a microscale, though that theory remains contested. What is not contested is the result. Streams of processed organic matter climbed those towers and were launched in pressurized biological packets toward the hive ships above, where massive intake structures on the undersides of the vessels received them like mouths waiting to be fed. The sight from orbit, had anyone been alive and positioned to observe it, would have looked like Satis was bleeding upward into space. The sheer volume of material being transferred is where the numbers start to break the human mind a little. Satis was an agri-world that had been under cultivation for over 3,000 years. The accumulated biomass of its ecosystem, from the root systems of its engineered grain crops to the vast microbial colonies in its soil to the bodies of its human and animal inhabitants, represented a staggering concentration of organic material. Fan analyses drawing on canonical Tyranid lore have estimated that a world the size and biological density of Satis could yield enough raw biomass to fuel the production of hundreds of millions of new bioconstructs, everything from basic rippers to massive carnifexes to the specialized organisms the hive mind uses for void combat. The Tyranids are not wasteful in any sense. Every molecule of carbon, every protein chain, every lipid and nucleotide pulled from the soil of Satis was being inventoried and routed toward whatever production need the hive mind had deemed most pressing. There is a deeply unsettling intimacy to this process that the lore sometimes glosses over in favor of the spectacle, but it deserves to be sat with for a moment. The bodies of the people of Satis, the farmers and the Planetary Defense Force soldiers, and the administratum clerks and the children were part of this flow. Everything that had ever lived on that world and died there, the generations buried in its soil, the animals that had decomposed into its fields, the humans who had spent their lives feeding the Imperium, all of it was now being drawn up through those pale towers and sent to feed a fleet that had no concept of them as individuals, as lives, as anything other than raw material. The hive mind does not mourn and it does not distinguish. A man and a microbe are equally useful to it once they have been reduced to their component chemistry. By the end of the second week of the invasion, observers on nearby systems reported that the visual signature of Satis had changed. Auger sweeps and long-range optical sensors showed the planet's surface darkening in ways that went beyond the expected destruction of vegetation. The capillary towers had become dense enough in some regions that they were altering the atmospheric chemistry above them, creating localized columns of altered air above each transfer site. The hive ships above were visibly more active, their biological processes running at higher output, their silhouettes shifting as new growth was stimulated by the incoming material. Satis was not just being consumed, it was being converted, its matter flowing upward in a continuous river that would not stop until there was nothing left to take. Up in the darkness beyond Satis's atmosphere, nestled deep within the organic architecture of the hive ships, something ancient and vast had already been waiting for this moment, long before the first Ripper touched ground. The Norn Queens are not creatures that most people in the Imperium ever see, and those who have studied them through recovered records or the traumatized memories of psychers who brushed against the hive mind describe them in terms that strain the limits of biological comprehension. They are enormous, sessile, and almost inconceivably complex, living processors that sit at the heart of the Tyranid fleet's biological infrastructure, the way a brain sits at the center of a nervous system, except that the Norn Queen is simultaneously brain, stomach, laboratory, and factory, all compressed into one organism that has been refined by millions of years of predatory evolution. As the biomass pipelines from Satis began delivering their cargo into the hive ships, the Norn Queens stirred into a deeper level of activity. It would be wrong to say they woke up, because they are never truly dormant, always processing, always receiving the constant whisper of the hive mind's collective consciousness. But the arrival of fresh, richly varied biomass from a world that had never before been touched by the Great Devourer represented something genuinely stimulating, even to organisms as alien and inscrutable as these. Satis had been isolated in its little corner of the Imperium for thousands of years, which meant its biological heritage was largely unsampled. Every organism that had evolved on that world, from its apex grain varieties down to its most obscure gut bacteria, represented genetic data that the hive mind had not yet fully processed and incorporated. This is why agri-worlds, despite their apparent military insignificance, are in many ways more valuable to the Tyranids than fortress worlds. A fortress world has soldiers and metal and stone. An agri-world has life, accumulated in extraordinary density and diversity across every square kilometer of its surface, and life is the only currency the hive mind actually cares about. The processing that the Norn Queens perform is not digestion in any sense that a human biologist would recognize, though it superficially resembles it. When biomass arrives through the living conduits that feed into their bodies, they do not simply break it down for energy. They conduct what can only be described as a comprehensive biological audit. Organic molecules are disassembled with extraordinary precision, not shredded randomly but taken apart in a way that preserves the informational content encoded within them. Proteins are unfolded and their amino acid sequences recorded. Lipid structures are catalogued. And most critically, genetic material, the DNA and equivalent molecules drawn from every organism in the harvest, is carefully extracted, stabilized, and subjected to a level of analysis that would be impossible with any technology the Imperium currently possesses. What makes this so remarkable and so deeply unsettling to contemplate is the speed at which it happens. Human geneticists working with the most advanced equipment available to the Adeptus Mechanicus might spend years analyzing the genome of a single organism in meaningful detail. The Norn Queens were processing the genetic heritage of an entire planet's worth of biodiversity within days. This is not because the Tyranids have technology in any conventional sense. They have biology, honed to a level of sophistication that dwarfs anything built from metal and circuits. The Norn Queen's internal structures are themselves biological machines, evolved over eons specifically for this purpose, capable of parallel processing on a scale that reduces the genome of a single species to something trivially simple to handle. They were not analyzing one organism at a time. They were analyzing everything simultaneously, running millions of genetic sequences against each other, cross-referencing, comparing, identifying patterns and anomalies with an efficiency that is almost offensive to consider. There is a fan theory within the Warhammer community, one that has circulated for years and feels increasingly supported by the lore as new material emerges, that suggests the Norn Queens do not simply process genetic material passively. They actively evaluate it. They make something resembling decisions about what is useful, what is redundant, and what represents a genuine innovation worth preserving in a more prominent way. This theory holds that the Norn Queen is not just a biological computer running automated analysis routines, but something closer to a scientist, albeit one operating on purely instinctual and hive mind-directed terms, that is genuinely engaged in the work of understanding the biological solutions that other life forms have independently arrived at. Whether or not one accepts that framing, the practical outcome is the same. Nothing that arrived from Satis was wasted, and nothing was processed carelessly. Every scrap of genetic information was treated as potentially valuable, because to the hive mind, it was. What the survivors of worlds near Satis found most disturbing when the reports eventually reached them was not the violence of the initial assault or even the completeness of the consumption. It was the implication of this processing stage, the quiet, methodical intelligence behind it. The Tyranids were not a natural disaster. Natural disasters do not take notes. The Norn Queens, taking apart the biological legacy of Satis, cell by cell, gene by gene, were doing something that felt horribly purposeful, building towards something that the Imperium could not yet fully see, adding one more world's worth of evolutionary secrets to a collection that had already been growing for longer than human civilization had existed. What makes the Norn Queens genuinely staggering to think about is not just that they process genetic material, but what they actually do with it once it arrives. The raw biomass funneled up from Satis was not simply consumed in the way you or I might think of consumption, as something broken down and burned for energy. The energy component was almost secondary. What the Norn Queens were primarily engaged in, once the initial breakdown and chemical sorting was underway, was something closer to what a librarian does, except the library in question contained the entire biological history of a living world, and every book in it had been written over millions of years of uninterrupted evolution. Satis had existed long before the Imperium ever claimed it. The planet's agricultural identity was a relatively recent overlay on top of a far older and more complex biological story. Before the first imperial colonists arrived and began converting its native ecosystems into productive farmland, Satis had its own indigenous flora, its own invertebrate fauna, its own fungal networks threading through ancient soil horizons, its own microbial communities that had been evolving in isolation for geological timescales. Much of that original biodiversity had been pushed to the margins by millennia of intensive agriculture, surviving only in uncultivated pockets, in seed banks, in the soil itself, in the microscopic life clinging to rock formations far from any plowed field. The Tyranids found all of it. They always find all of it. And the Norn queens cataloged every single genetic sequence they encountered, down to organisms that had never been observed, named, or even suspected by imperial xenobiologists. The cataloging process itself is one of the most discussed topics among those few scholars who study Tyranid biology with any seriousness, and the fan theories and xenological debates that have grown up around it are genuinely fascinating. The dominant understanding, pieced together from intercepted synaptic resonance data and the rare captured bioform that has been vivisected under controlled conditions, is that the Norn queens do not simply store genetic sequences passively. They actively analyze them, running what amounts to a continuous comparative assessment against the vast accumulated database of every world the hive mind has ever consumed. Every organism from Satis was being cross-referenced against organisms from 1,000 other worlds, its traits evaluated for potential utility, its evolutionary solutions assessed for how they might be combined, modified, or repurposed within new bioforms. This is not metaphorical. The hive mind is, in the most literal biological sense, running experiments that span galactic distances and millions of years of data. What this means for Satis specifically is that nothing the planet had ever produced, in terms of biological innovation, was wasted or overlooked. Consider something as apparently trivial as the drought resistance adaptations in the native grasses that had been largely displaced by imperial grain cultivars. Those grasses had spent millions of years developing molecular mechanisms for surviving water stress, for closing stomata with extraordinary efficiency, for storing carbohydrates in ways that allowed rapid recovery after desiccation. To an imperial agronomist, those grasses were weeds. To the Norn queens, they were a solved engineering problem, a biological patent that the hive mind could now incorporate into future bioforms designed to operate in arid environments. The same logic applied to every organism catalogued, from the largest to the most microscopic. There is something almost philosophical about this aspect of Tyranid behavior that fans of the lore return to again and again, and it is worth sitting with for a moment. The Imperium of Man, for all its vast resources and millennia of history, has never produced anything close to a comprehensive catalogue of the life it has encountered across the galaxy. Imperial xenobiologists work in fragments with incomplete data on worlds that are rarely studied thoroughly before they are either colonized or lost to war or disaster. The Tyranids, by contrast, have been systematically cataloging the galaxy's biological heritage for longer than humanity has existed as a spacefaring species. Every world they consume adds to a database of incomprehensible scope. By the time the Splinter Fleet finished with Satis, the hive mind knew more about that planet's evolutionary history than any imperial scientist ever had or ever could have. The speed at which this cataloging occurred is another element that the records from Satis, fragmentary as they are, help illuminate. The initial processing of raw biomass into analyzable genetic material happened within hours of the first harvests reaching the hive ships. The deeper cataloging, the comparative analysis and cross-referencing against existing hive mind data ran concurrently with the ongoing consumption of the planet below. The Norn queens were not waiting for the harvest to be complete before they began their work. They were processing the incoming stream of biological data in real time, which means that by the time Satis was fully stripped, the cataloging was already largely finished. The efficiency of this system is staggering when you actually try to comprehend it, and it speaks to why the Tyranids are not simply a force of destruction, but something far more dangerous, a force of accumulation, growing smarter and more adaptable with every world they consume. One detail that emerges from deeper analysis of this phase of the Satis consumption is that the cataloging was not uniform across all species. Certain organisms received what the data suggests was heightened analytical attention, specifically those that had developed unusual or novel solutions to evolutionary pressures. The soil microbes of Satis, as discussed in the context of their harvesting, had produced several biochemical pathways that were genuinely rare in the hive mind's existing database, adaptations to the specific mineral composition of Satis's deep rock layers that had no close analogues in previously consumed worlds. Those organisms, invisible to the naked eye and unknown to imperial science, received disproportionate processing time from the Norn queens. Whatever evolutionary secrets they carried are now part of the hive mind forever, waiting to be expressed in some future bioform on some future battlefield that has not yet been imagined. There comes a point in the consumption of a world where the Tyranids shift from active harvesting to something closer to finishing work, a final sweep that is almost methodical in its thoroughness, and Satis reached that point within weeks of the fleet's arrival. The surface was already unrecognizable by then. The fields were gone, the soil layers had been processed down to bare mineral substrate, and even the microbial networks that had once threaded through every cubic centimeter of Earth had been extracted and funneled upward into the waiting hive ships. What remained was not a wounded planet or a damaged one. It was something categorically different, a world that had been hollowed of everything that made it biologically meaningful, and the Tyranids were not finished yet. The atmosphere itself began to change in those final weeks. Satis had possessed a breathable, standard composition atmosphere maintained in equilibrium by the same vast network of plant life and microbial activity that the swarm had now consumed. With the vegetation gone and the soil biome stripped to nothing, there was nothing left to regulate the chemical balance of the air. Carbon dioxide levels climbed as the biological processes that had once absorbed and recycled atmospheric gases ceased entirely. The skies darkened not from cloud cover, but from the particulate matter thrown up by millions of Tyranid organisms still moving across the surface, and from the chemical byproducts of the digestion pools that had been operating at full capacity for weeks. Witnesses in orbit, those few Imperial vessels that had managed to retreat to a distance where they could observe without being consumed, described the planet's color changing visibly over the course of days, the blue and green and gold of a living agri-world fading first to brown, then to gray, and finally to a pale bleached ochre that reminded one surviving officer of old bone. The Ripper swarms, which had been the first creatures deployed and which had been working continuously since the initial landing, were among the last to be recalled. This is something that fan theorists and lore enthusiasts often point to as evidence of just how precisely the hive mind sequences its operations. The Rippers were not simply released and left to wander. They were directed, systematically, through areas that had already been processed by larger organisms, gleaning the fragments and residue that the termagants and the harvester organisms had left behind. Nothing was wasted. A termagant moving through a stripped field might leave behind fragments of root fiber or trace amounts of organic compound clinging to mineral rock, and the Rippers would follow in their wake and collect even that. The efficiency is almost impossible to comprehend when you sit with it long enough. The hive mind was not satisfied with 99%. It was working towards something as close to absolute as biology permits. The harvester organisms themselves, those vast biological processing units that had been anchoring the biomass pipelines connecting surface to ship, began to withdraw in the final stages. They retracted in sequence, pulling their feeding tendrils back through the tunnels they had bored through the crust, collapsing those tunnels behind them as they went. The hive ships above drew them back up through the same umbilical structures that had been funneling processed material upward throughout the entire operation. Even these retrieval structures, the biological cables and conduits that had stretched between orbit and surface, were consumed as they were retracted, the organic material of the conduits themselves broken down and absorbed so that nothing, not even the tools of the harvest, was left behind as waste. What the Tyranids left on Satis was not rubble in any conventional sense. There were no ruins because the Tyranids had consumed the structural materials of every settlement along with the biological matter. The grain silos were gone, their ferrocrete and metal frameworks stripped of every organic compound that could be extracted. The hab clusters where farming families had lived for generations were reduced to bare mineral frameworks, and then those too were examined, processed where possible, and abandoned only where the material offered nothing the hive mind could use. The roads, the irrigation channels, the agricultural machinery, all of it was assessed, and the organic components separated out and consumed. What remained was inorganic debris, scattered across a surface that was now essentially a desert of mineral dust and exposed rock, swept by winds that had no moisture in them because even the water cycle of the planet had been disrupted beyond recovery. There is a detail that appears in some of the recovered Mechanicus assessments of Tyranid-consumed worlds that always strikes me as particularly haunting, which is the silence. Not metaphorical silence, but literal acoustic silence. A living world is never quiet. Wind moves through vegetation and creates sound. Animals call to one another. Insects produce constant background noise. Flowing water, settling soil, the movement of organisms through undergrowth, all of it contributes to a planetary soundscape that living beings rarely notice because it is simply always there. On Satis, in those final days before the fleet withdrew, there was none of that. The wind still moved across the surface, but it moved across bare rock and mineral dust and produced only the flat, toneless sound of air crossing an inert surface. Nothing called back to it. Nothing rustled or shifted or responded. The world had gone acoustically dead in a way that no natural catastrophe could replicate, because natural catastrophes leave survivors, leave seeds in the soil, leave spores in the air. The Tyranids had left none of those things. There is a particular kind of grief that comes with understanding what was truly lost when Satis died, and it is not the grief most people reach for first. The immediate losses are obvious enough: the food supply disrupted, the imperial worlds that depended on those harvests suddenly scrambling for alternatives, the administrative headache of logging another world as lost to the Great Devourer and updating the charts accordingly. Those losses are real, and they matter in the cold accounting language of the Imperium, but they are not the deepest loss. The deepest loss is something far more difficult to put into words, and it lives in the space between what Satis was and what the hive mind made of it. Every living thing on Satis had been shaped by billions of years of evolution. The grain crops that covered those rolling fields had ancestors stretching back through geological time, organisms that had survived mass extinctions, climate shifts, the slow drift of continents, the rise and fall of atmospheric compositions that would be lethal to anything alive today. The livestock, the insects that pollinated those crops, the earthworms threading through the soil, the root fungi forming invisible networks beneath every field, the bacteria processing nitrogen in ways so efficient that human agricultural science had spent centuries trying to reverse engineer them. All of it carried within its genetic code a staggeringly complex record of survival. Millions of years of trial and error, of species collapsing and adapting and diverging and merging, compressed into sequences of biological information that no human instrument had ever fully mapped or understood. All of that, every strand of it, was now inside the hive mind. And that is where the true weight of what happened to Satis becomes almost unbearable to sit with. It was not destroyed. It was not simply erased. It was taken. The biological legacy of an entire world, the product of an evolutionary history that predated humanity by incomprehensible margins, had been absorbed, catalogued, and filed away in the distributed consciousness of an alien intelligence that spans the galaxy, and it will never be returned. The Imperium lost a food producer. The galaxy lost something it cannot name, and the Tyranids gained something they will use. Fan theorists within the Warhammer community have spent considerable time debating exactly what the hive mind does with these absorbed legacies over the long term, and the most compelling arguments center on what you might call the inheritance problem. The hive mind does not simply store genetic information passively, the way a library stores books. It actively cross-references, tests, and recombines what it absorbs, running the biological equivalent of simulations across the vast processing architecture of the Norn Queens and whatever deeper structures exist within the hive ships themselves. The nitrogen-fixing bacteria from Satis's soil might, in some future campaign on a world with different atmospheric chemistry, find themselves expressed in a new Tyranid bioform that processes atmospheric gases with unusual efficiency. The drought resistance bred into Satis's grain strains over generations of agricultural cultivation might one day appear in a Tyranid organism designed to operate in arid environments. Nothing is wasted. Nothing sits idle. The legacy of Satis will be expressed, in forms its original inhabitants would never recognize, across future battlefields that those inhabitants never lived to see. There is something philosophically horrifying about this that goes beyond the usual horror of Tyranid destruction, and it is worth sitting with that horror for a moment rather than rushing past it. When a world burns in a chaos incursion, when an orc war tears through a system and leaves rubble behind, the destruction is at least final in a recognizable way. What was there is gone. The Tyranids do not offer that. They offer something worse, which is transformation without consent. The living world of Satis, everything it had been for billions of years, continues to exist in a sense, threaded through the genetic memory of the hive mind, potentially expressed in new organisms across the centuries and millennia to come. Satis is not gone. Satis has been conscripted into the very force that killed it, and it will serve the Great Devourer long after the last imperial record of its existence has crumbled to dust. The Psykers who have touched the edges of the hive mind and survived, and there are very few of them, consistently describe something that resists easy categorization. It is not a void. It is not silence. It is, if anything, an overwhelming density of accumulated experience, a weight of biological memory so vast that human consciousness cannot parse it without fracturing. Some of those Psykers have reported fragments that might be interpreted as echoes of consumed worlds, not as memories in any human sense, but as flavors, as textures, as something that functions the way instinct functions, a deep knowing that bypasses conscious thought entirely. Whether what they are sensing is truly the absorbed legacy of worlds like Satis, or simply their own minds trying to impose narrative on an incomprehensible alien intelligence, is impossible to say with certainty. But the possibility that Satis exists somewhere in that density, not as a memory but as a biological truth woven into the fabric of the swarm, is one of those ideas that, once encountered, proves very difficult to shake. What Satis represents, in the end, is a lesson the Imperium keeps learning and keeps failing to fully absorb. The Tyranids are not an enemy that can be understood through the lens of conquest or territory or even survival in the way most threats are understood. They are a process, a biological reckoning that has been moving through the galaxy since before most of the species currently fighting in it had developed spaceflight, and every world they consume makes them incrementally, inexorably better at consuming the next one. Satis fed the great devourer not just with matter, but with information, and that information is now part of something that will outlast the planet itself by an unimaginable margin. The fields are gone, the people are gone. The world is a mineral husk drifting in space. But the biological soul of Satis, if such a thing can be said to exist, marches on in the swarm, repurposed and unrecognizable, serving a hunger that has no end and asks no permission. If you found this kind of deep dive into the grim darkness of the 41st millennium worthwhile, subscribing to the channel means more of it coming your way.